I've been told that I'm going to stay in the government, defying the Constitution, but that is not the case. At the end of my mandate, I don't know where I'll be, but I won't be in power. As a citizen of the Republic of Colombia, I know that's the hat I'll be wearing and not that of the President of Colombia. So this is, in fact, perhaps my last statement in this arena. I've delivered a number in the United Nations in general, but this may well be my last. So we're now going to talk about security. I thank you for your remarks, Secretary General. And I'm now going to address you. I'll most likely give a summary of what I could say, but what I'm going to say has to do with the following. The use of new ITCs in the hands of a very small group of very powerful people, economically powerful, that is, a very small group worldwide. In my view, this phenomenon has already sowed disinformation. We've seen truth and lies blurred. That's perhaps the first effect of this possession of ITCs, and perhaps the most harmful. I am in no way an enemy of science or technology. Applied science, if applied with good reason, I'm in favor of that, but there can be no neutral technology. What's key is why technologies are being developed and used. There are a range of technologies in human hands, and there are a range of goals that one technology can pursue. It's used according to the whims of the politicians that it falls in the hands of, and in line with their economic agenda. Truths are distorted, they become lies. Public opinion gets confused. These lies are sowed among the general public. Lies become truths, and as Hawking was saying, the great physicist who recently passed, he was saying that this blurring of truth and lies could lead to the death of humankind. I was not surprised at all, because in recent times I've been of the belief, and that's been the position I've adopted in the international arena and the position of my and Colombia's diplomacy, which has radiated as far as it's able. Our position has been that the climate crisis is the result of the expansive consumption of hydrocarbons from the Industrial Revolution to date, and I was surprised that such a notable physicist it was he who talked about these problems. It wasn't an ideologue, it was a scientist. There's a difference between science and ideology. Ideology is in and of itself a twisting of reality. That was said as early on as the 19th century. But the science is more neutral. Science contemplates humankind, and science is the only thing that can pave the way through ignorance and light our path. There's no doubt that we need to therefore talk about two events, two facts, not only of one. And there's one item that was the primary agenda of the Security Council. And that's one thing I could talk about. But my country, there's another one we could talk about, and I hope my country will bear that in mind when they choose their future. We chart the course of humankind depending on the decisions we take. And a key concept here is artificial intelligence in the hands of a private elite, an economically powerful elite. And that's what we have today. There's also the phenomenon of the widespread consumption of hydrocarbons as a result of greed. And that has brought us to the climate crisis and brought us to the wars that you have rightly described, Secretary General. That is the fight for hydrocarbons, the fight for oil. That's what makes missiles rain down on peoples, on babies. 20,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Those numbers cannot be hidden. No political or economic interest can conceal that fact. And that is the real red thread of what I'm going to say here. We're going back to the era of the Nazis. And that is what's happening today, expansively across the world. We're not only talking about Gaza now. If you like, that is the cultural origin of the war in the Middle East. But now what's happening, there's oil and stockpiles of nuclear weapons everywhere, and the war is spreading, and that gives us the situation now unfolding in the Middle East, and we're attempting to resolve that situation with more missiles and more war. This situation is entirely bound up with a desire to circumvent a policy or an agenda which should be at the heart of humankind. That agenda is the rapid decarbonization of our world. There are two policies that could resolve the current most dire problems we're facing. Problems that undermine the ability of us all to enjoy the very existence of our plants and animals, and undermine our very ability to enjoy life with a capital L across the whole of Mother Earth. And Hawking was saying, he said, well, we don't have a great deal of time left on Earth, some 200 years. I think if we look now, time has run, the clock's run down yet further still. Perhaps we've got 100 years left. I think the IPCC, universities, research centers have said just that. They've used their computing methods and models, and they've said that in the area of the planet where my country lies, in 2070, there'll be no water. My children will be alive then, and the children of all of you will be alive then, as will your grandchildren. If there's no water in my region, 3 billion people will be where the water is now. It will be the end of them. And that is the situation in which we currently found ourselves. And that's a result of this false ideology, this false anti-migration ideology. We've got this policy of barbarism that we're already seeing unfold. And with all of that, what I want to say now is to dwell on this issue and to look at Colombia's experience. What we have to look at now is this fast living that we seem to have now. There's a conflict. I think this conflict has been resolved, but there is a conflict which is once again an epicenter of violence. But we're not talking about Republicans against the monarchy, as was the case of the conflict in the United Kingdom at one point. We're not talking about the Irish conflict, which pit the Irish against the English, or a war between the English and English. All of those wars saw a great eruption of violence, and then things were then resolved, and a great number of people died in these conflicts. Children also did. And great songs were written about these conflicts. I think some of those songwriters have died, but the process was ultimately successful. A peaceful resolution to these conflicts was found, but now houses are burning again, and the conflict has changed face, and we need to analyze current conflicts in depth. Because we're not talking about a conflict in Belfast anymore, but we're really talking about a global conflict, and the source of it is racial hatred. And we must be clear, there is no such thing as race in the world. Race is a human construct. There are cats, dogs, horses, others, and these genes can be manipulated, and all of that's kind of used to create this construct of race. But race no longer exists, and these racial conflicts that there were in, for example, Belfast are now playing out elsewhere. We're going back to the Nazis. They didn't really believe in race, but they manipulated it and brought it to its worst possible conclusion. We have the World War II, the Nazis. Many countries here present collaborated with efforts to defeat the Nazis. They did that as peoples, not as invaded states. States and peoples resisted what was to be the advent of the worst form of slavery on humankind. But today, states aren't as lucid about how to assume their responsibility to fight against racism against their own peoples. Peoples and the concept of race are being manipulated. I'm predicting that these conflicts, these racially fueled conflict, will spread to and take on dimensions that the popular imagination couldn't have even conceived of previously. So in my opinion, in Belfast, we're seeing suffering similar to that wrought upon Colombia and other countries that I know well. There are other countries I know not so well, but I can nevertheless draw the same conclusion. The power of artificial intelligence is fueling the violence in Belfast, just as it is currently fueling the violence in Colombia. The source is the same, and that is in the midst of the electoral period. To date, these have been the most peaceful elections in my country's history. They've been held under my government, but I can already see threats rearing their head. When artificial intelligence is in the hands of private companies and individuals today, there's competition, logical, market-based competition. But when that logic of competition rears its head, we see monopolies, oligopolies take shape. Today, artificial intelligence is a private oligopoly, and it has produced competition between the United States and China. That is the so-called trade war. That's nothing more than a race to achieve speed, computational capacity. And today, that's the hallmark of development, the development which is afforded to some countries and not others. What we're seeing is the beginning of a new form of social inequality, socioeconomic inequality, dividing human beings. We're not going to allow that form of development to take root. My government's already said that, but we've seen that forces have been sabotaging our project, and we've seen that for years. The capacity for development is located now in 2 countries and the others are excluded. They can compete, but the very principle of competition is what's leading to a situation whereby ITCs, a form of ITCs with computational capacity spreading throughout the world at breakneck speed or microchip speed, if you like, these technologies are being fueled by oil and spreading across the world, and then you end up plunging humankind into a climate crisis. As Hawking said, this is all what happens if you ultimately separate reality from non-reality. We cannot separate, or you rather have to be able to separate truth and lies. If you blur the line between truth and lies, that's where the trouble begins. That you'll end up not with half lies, but total lies. And that's what we're seeing in the case of Belfast. And that's what I saw yesterday. I dared to go on the X platform before it was called X. I was a bit naive. I'm not technologically adept. I didn't properly contextualize a phrase that was answered by a Colombian during an internal discussion. That person said they'd moved from being liberal to a fascist, but I won't give that person's name, but that's not important here. What is important is what happened. I think I put "Hey Hitler" on that platform, and 34 million people saw what I wrote. I thought, oh no, all of Colombia's watching this debate, laughing at it, but no, that's not possible. I'd never seen a tweet of mine spread to that extent. Even when I was tweeting Donald Trump at a difficult moment of bilateral relations between our countries. There was huge take-up of that tweet. Almost all of the adult population of Colombia, even though 40% of our adults have no connectivity. But I began to realize what was happening when I looked at what was playing out in Belfast. What had happened is we were seeing the unleashing of collective violence, and that's exactly what happened. With Belfast, the same thing happened. A crime that has to be brought before the courts, that's what we saw. The same thing's playing out in many regions of the world. We see these crimes that are then translated into an ideology or pinned to an ideology that X is sowing the seeds of and spreading. There's a member of the British Parliament on the far right who yesterday wrote, I think he's called Rupert Lowe, and he wrote yesterday, I think, there was an attempt to murder someone. I think the supposed culprit was Somalian. I think we've got the representative of Somalia here. And that MP said that that attempted murder was the result of migration and that all migrants are culpable. And that's a Nazi stance being adopted, a criminal Nazi stance right there, because Nazism is not an ideology. Nazi is not even an ideology, it's a crime. So what this MP says, the migrants are to blame. That's what he said. It was the same not said about the Jews in Europe. Nazis are criminals. And there was this idea that you had to collectivize the blame and put it on the shoulders of a whole group when what we're talking about is one person. And that's actually illegal to do that. It's like when you have a Jew in Germany that committed a crime, and Goebbels and Hitler used that to say that the entire Jewish population were responsible. That was the same thing with the Reichstag fire in Berlin. I saw that event. The Reichstag fire was not caused by what the Nazis said it was caused by. They said it was staged by Jewish Bolshevik communists. That wasn't the case. They set that fire themselves to blame German social democracy, German Jews, socialists, workers, etc., communists, Jews, peasants, and that was what they used to send them all to jail. The people that helped us neutralize Hitler is currently withdrawing from the international arena, and that's a great shame. I'm on the OFAC list as a result of my ideology. You can't be ashamed of having fought against the Nazis and having defeated them, standing shoulder to shoulder with other peoples of Europe. It's a great source of sorrow to see what's happening now. Why are these former allies withdrawing from the stage? They should be flying high that flag, really proud of fighting for life and democracy. What we're seeing in Colombia is exactly the same thing. It's the same thing we're seeing playing out in Belfast. I've explained it, more or less. Here, neighbours are beating activists that are debating and standing against this government. Poor neighbourhoods are being pitted against each other. Truths are becoming lies, lies are becoming truths, reality and irreality being mixed. AI is financed hugely by this elite, and that's the problem. We're witnessing global violence that involves missiles raining down against babies, houses burned, wars across the globe. Basta ya was a slogan. Now it means that's enough, and it was a slogan used to say, no, that's enough killing. They were talking about enough murders, but we're not trying to now kill vast swathes of humankind. We're seeing the death penalty for all migrants. That's what's being called for. The owner of this X network is championing such policies. There's this idea that all migrants should be sent to their deaths. And with that proposal, what should we do with it? Hitler? That's not who we should be focusing on. We've got this anti-migrant ideology. We've got this racist policy because it claims to defend this whiteness of one's skin that is an artificial construct, because there is no race in the world. There are myriad ways of binding with, relating to nature. Workers are equal across the world, whatever their skin color, whatever their origins, whichever region they come from. So these scientific falsehoods see us deny science. And that's what we're seeing on this issue and on the climate crisis. And that's bringing us to the brink of barbarism. And that's the very opposite goal to that pursued by this council. Israel's withdrawn. Their people came here. Their people suffered a Holocaust waged against them by the Nazis. They came to the United States, whose people were the sons of workers and peasants, millions, in their millions. They came to the United States, went to other countries, and their struggle was won. That is the struggle for humankind and life, and we need to honor these people, but we need to recognize why. Today, the truth is being distorted into lies. So I would ask all of you to wage a war on these two fronts. The first, Stephen Hawking, the physicist, said the first front was AI, and that was an issue he pointed to. Then there's the anti-immigration discourse. Today, that discourse is much more powerful than it was and is being taken up and heeded by the majority of voters in many countries, because that ideology is being disseminated through AI, through the manipulation of humankind's conscience. It's being manipulated by a tiny elite with a huge amount of power that's rallying behind the same single vision. The idea that the white race that doesn't exist needs to be defended from a cultural aggression which is seeking to exterminate them. That's what they say, but no such thing is happening, because the United Nations is the very proof of the fact that what we want to see is a global democracy. A democracy which can see us sit down as different civilizations and talk to each other. So, allow me to conclude. Artificial intelligence cannot be managed by 5 individuals with private interests. Whether they're Chinese, from the United States, or wherever else they may hail from, AI needs to be globally regulated. This has been called for by the ideological school, or part of it, the school to which I belong. And it's now being called for by the Catholic Church through its spokesperson, Pope Leo XIV. He recently called for that regulation in his encyclical, Magnificent Humankind. He talked about human brotherliness. How can we get there? That was the very purpose of the founding of the United Nations after a horrific war that caused 50 million deaths in Europe, some 25 million in Asia. That was the UN's purpose, but how do we achieve that purpose? I propose that we embark upon this journey by tackling the main source of conflict and insecurity, that is AI and its propagation of anti-migration discourse. Let's tackle that. There needs to be global and public regulation of artificial intelligence. There needs to be an international treaty. Under international law, we need to be restoring international law and salvaging it from any attempts to destroy it, attempts that we're seeing today. International law, if you get rid of it, you'll see barbarism. That's what you see in the distortion of photos. And this distortion is done with a Nazi ideology behind it. Again, these lines between truth and reality being blurred, that's what AI that's badly regulated does. It's badly regulated when other interests are behind it, and that's why we need democratic public regulation of AI. That's what we are discussing that, but it's not the main point of our agenda. And in fact, it is the very crux of peace, because the Jürgen Habermas recently passed, the philosopher, was saying that the lack of communication means that what we used to have are real criminals in the dock, and now what you have is people that adopt a different stance to you, and that's who is now untried. He was saying that lack of social communication is the very source of violence. That was that philosopher's discourse. If there's no such thing as social communication, or if it's manipulated, what we end up with is violence and barbarism. And so this is my appeal to you on behalf of my martyred people, my people that have fallen victim to violence, as have many other peoples in the third world, if that's what you want to call it. Because the English Member of Parliament said that the third world are those that are to blame because they're barbarians. How dare he call them barbarians? Barbarians deny other people's cultures. The Romans dealt with the barbarians, and Alexander the Great himself talked about a dialogue between civilizations instead of barbarians, and that is the right path. Dialogue between civilizations, not this dissolution of dialogue. That will bring us to barbarism, to the end of democracy, and to the end of humankind. This war cannot be won by the richest among us or that person who has the most missiles. That's not how the war is won. Now, let me talk about the climate crisis that was the focus of my speech initially. How can you deny science? The global agenda is now one of migration and wars. Wars caused by oil. We're not focusing on the rapid decarbonization of our world and the global and public regulation of artificial intelligence. I think these are the two focuses we need to have to rescue the brotherly relations binding humans together and to bring to peace. What binds humans together is respect and communication, respect for science and respect for science. Respect and respect for science as two separate things. If we forget all of that, we'll end up plunged into barbarism. Here, people sitting around this table will end up walking away from this table because social communication will be denied. No one will be listening to anyone else. That philosopher Habermas talked about the rupture, the breakdown of social communication, and how that led to violence. I think that was a message conveyed when the Twin Towers fell, and we started to talk about social justice. Social justice is dialogue between those that don't agree, and it involves them ultimately finding common ground. Then there's the migration crisis, but behind the migration crisis is war, the climate crisis, and the impoverishment of economies fueled by greed. If you get a coffee on the corner, I don't know, is it $2? I'm not sure how much it is, but very expensive because it's right here next to the UNHQ, but they only give a minuscule amount of that money to the coffee producers, for example, in Colombia. That's a result of a lack of social justice in the world. It can be easily resolved as problems go. But if we don't talk to each other, no solutions can be found. I talked to the President of the United States personally, face to face in his office, and the conversation was a pleasant one, and I thought that we'd been talking man to man and not about business. So I left all happy. Today, the President of the United States is supporting a candidate defying explicitly the Constitution because he's spearheading this ideology going against the very Pope himself. Of course, everyone has the right to their own beliefs, whatever those beliefs might be, including the Islam faith. And that is a very principle of democracy, freedom of worship. That must be protected. That's one thing. I'm not Catholic. Not entirely, because I saw wars play out between churches and peoples, but today I can embrace some of its ideology, and that is the idea that we're united in our diversity. Ultimately, what's important is not falling into the trap of this anti-migration ideology. That's a Nazi ideology, and that's why I'm victimized when I come here and say things like that. Colombian migrants here are being hit, punched, sent to concentration camps. They're being put in chains. I've opposed just that. And that in the past is a problem that has been solved by dialogue. My government paid for me to come here. I paid for my own flights, but what I was essentially paying for is dignity, and I don't think that's a bad way to spend your money. So this problem of migrants being chained and coming back to my country was solved. They're no longer being chained, and it was a good thing to pay for. That was all a solution reached with dialogue. Thank you, Secretary General. I'll leave it there. I now wish again to resume my function as President of the Council, and that brings me to my speakers list. We are now going to begin